welcome back, Biology 104. Today we're going to be covering the Cnidaria notes. And the little statement here at the beginning says, the fish that stings but is not really a fish. And you're right if you said jellyfish. Jellyfish belong to Cnidaria, and we'll be talking about this. And jellyfish are not fish. Fish are vertebrates. They have a backbone, brain, heart, fins, gills. Jellyfish are invertebrates. They have no backbone, no brain, no heart, no blood, no gills. They have these soft gelatinous bodies and these stinging cells. So they're definitely different. They are not fish. So for the classification of Cnidaria, we're going to be domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Cnidaria. In the phylum Cnidaria, it is actually debated how many classes there are. Depends on the classification. It could anywhere from 4 to 6. So if it's split up into 5, those 5 classes would be Hydrozoa, Scyphozoa, Cubozoa, Anthozoa, and Staurozoa. Staurozoa often isn't included, and they just do those first 4 that were mentioned. Now, the name Cnidaria, what that means is nettle animals, and a nettle would be a plant that can sting by injecting into someone irritants from these little hairs on their leaves. So Cnidos means stinging nettle in Greek. So Cnidaria is that they sting. That's why they have that name. And they have these nematocysts or cnidae that allow them to sting. So that's where the name Cnidaria comes from. So you should be thinking jellyfish when you hear Cnidaria. And we have what's called true jellyfish, and we'll look at some of these examples of all of it. So generally, though, conservatively, there are 4 classes for the phylum Cnidaria. This is going to include, for the 4, Hydrozoa, Scyphozoa, is how you say that, Cubozoa, and Anthozoa. Now, some will group these into 5 classes, and they add Staurozoa, or even 6 classes, and they have Myxozoa as the 6th class. But generally, you'll see it said that there are 4 classes of Cnidaria. The characteristics of Cnidaria, they're all going to be aquatic and mostly are going to be marine. They are all carnivores. They are looking for prey to eat. They're going to exhibit radial symmetry. When we think radial, think of like the radius, which is of a circle. Radial symmetry is where no matter how you split it from the top down, they are going to be symmetrical on both sides. They have 2 body forms. That's going to be the polyp and the medusa. For the polyp, that's going to be the form of a Cnidaria that is sessile. The mouth and the tentacles are going to be facing up. So if you can imagine just the cup sitting on the table, right, the opening faces up. That would be the polyp form. The mouth faces up, and the tentacles will move upwards. And then the medusa looks kind of like an alien from Space Invaders, where the tentacles hang down. And this is going to be that free swimming form, what we think of as like a classic jellyfish. That's what you should think of when you think of the medusa. And then polyp, you should think of like the shape of like a sea anemone. The characteristics of Cnidaria, they're going to contain tentacles with stinging cells called the cnidocysts or cnidocytes. Within the cnidocytes are the stinging apparatuses called the nematocyst. And it's that venom that is released that can be extremely toxic. So it just depends on the species, but it could destroy cells, it could destroy blood, or it could attack the nervous system. Very few stings are actually fatal, but they actually can be. It is possible to die from some of these toxins that are released from these nematocysts. The body has 2 layers. It has the epidermis and the gastrodermis. And that they call these diploblastic organisms, or arising from 2 germ layers. The epidermis, think about skin, that's going to be the outer layer. And then the gastrodermis, think gastric, think stomach. This is going to be the inner layer, and that's going to line the gastrovascular cavity. So just the names themselves can help you think about what part or layer they make up on the Cnidaria. The mesoglia, we think of jellyfish, the jelly of them. The mesoglia makes up that jelliness, and that is a layer between the epidermis and the gastrodermis. And in jellyfish, that mesoglea is much thicker, and that's where they get that name, jellyfish, from. And that's what you feel when you feel a jellyfish. They're going to have a nerve net. There's questions about whether or not, can jellyfish or Cnidaria, any of these groups, classes, can they feel pain? And because they do not have a brain or any central nervous system that can process stimuli anywhere in this nerve net, they don't process pain like we do. There's no consciousness of the pain, right? There's no emotions. There's no memory. It can register that something's happened. It can respond to it, but it's not processing it like we do, like we are conscious of our pain that we experience. So generally, we say they do not feel pain. And they call that nociception, which is where you can detect, damage or irritation and then respond to it. So they'll have like a reflex, reflexive action. They might contract or withdraw or fire a nematocyst, for example, some toxins into a predator of some type or their prey. But they're not, registering that pain is happening in their body or anything like that because they don't have a brain. So for the reproduction, they're going to have sexual reproduction and they're going to have asexual. For sexual, they're going to produce a ciliated planula larvae, and that's going to be motile. And for asexual reproduction, they're going to have budding and in the polyp form. So the planula larvae swims around using its cilia. That's considered the larval stage of the Cnidaria. And then that will develop, that develops from a fertilized egg, and it will eventually settle somewhere to form a polyp. For the asexual reproduction, it's basically like this. A new organism, basically, a new individual, grows as like an outgrowth of the parent organism's body wall, of that parent polyp's body wall, and that's what it would look like there. We see this budding. Now, like, what causes this to happen? Why would they, sometimes would they bud or sometimes would they sexually reproduce? Well, the environment is going to affect which type of reproduction that they use. So if there's like really high food availability, the environmental conditions have been very consistent and ideal, and the cells are, have everything they need, there's low stress, then the organisms will actually favor budding. Versus if the environmental conditions are more harsh and unpredictable, the organisms will actually favor sexual reproduction. And there's a good reason for that. If environment's changing, well, what's going to create genetic diversity that would allow the organisms to adapt to the environment? It would be sexual reproduction. Unique sperm and egg, fertilization, you get a new genetically unique organism. So that is favored in tougher circumstances, which is super cool. And it's all automatically regulated. There's no thoughts going on here that they're thinking about and planning this. It's just completely automatic. So this is what the planula larvae looks like, and the ephora there on the right, and then planula larvae on the left. And the names for these come from, we'll start with planula. The planula word comes from a Latin word planus, which means flat. So planula means little flat one. And if we look at that larvae there on the left, it's a little flat, rounded edged, rectangular larvae. It's like a little plate. So, when swimming around and before settlement, this is what they're going to look like. And that's why the zoologists, when they discovered this, that's why they called it planula, from the Latin flat. And the ephora is what you see there on the right. And ephora comes from the Greek word ephora, which means something that has grown, or offspring. And if you look at it, it looks kind of like a flower with, dozens and dozens of petals coming out all the way around in that radial circular shape. So that's why it has the name ephora. So the Cnidaria classes for hydrozoa. We think about that name, hydro, and then zoa. You break that apart, hydro is water, zoa, right, zoology, it's animals. So this is a water animal. So most of these species will exhibit polyp and medusa stages in their life cycle. Some only exhibit the polyp form, which means it has no medusa stage. So the example would be the freshwater hydra, and we'll look at some images of these. The polyp stage for most species is colonial, which is really cool. We'll talk about the difference in colonial organisms and a multicellular animal, because those are two different things. But it's basically colonial, just many cells, many different organisms stuck together, basically working together like a multicellular animal, which is pretty cool. So reproduction is going to involve alternation of generations like we see in plants. And this can be called metagenesis, where they alternate from sexual reproduction to asexual and then back to sexual, etc. So our organism here for hydrozoa is going to be Physalia physalis, I believe is how you pronounce that. It's the genus species name. And the common name of that is the Portuguese man of war. So this species is actually a colony. So it's a colonial organism. So it's a floating group or colony of all these polyp and medusa individual cells, or really individual organisms. So it's considered an animal, it's Animalia, but it is not a single multicellular organism. And we call this a siphonophore, or a colonial organism is what they're classified as. So if we think about a siphonophore versus a multicellular animal, a colonial organism is just a group of genetically identical, specialized individuals. So that's different from all of the cells arising from, one cell in this multicellular animal. It's more integrated with a multicellular animal. You would have like true tissues in a multicellular animal, like muscle cells, nerve cells, skin cells, etc. So this is different. And a colonial organism, it really blurs the lines there between what is a animal, like what is a multicellular animal. It's kind of in between an individual and a multicellular animal, or unicellular and multicellular. It's kind of in between there. It's really, really neat. But anyway, for this example, they are solitary, and they can be attached to the substrate for the hydra via a basal disc. That's what a hydra would be. So it can glide along the substrate and can somersault to move to new locations. And then Obelia would be one that would be the colonial hydroid, and that's what you see there. On the bottom, it has kind of these branchings. It looks like tree branches is the shape of it. And then this would be an image of the Portuguese man of war. So what it has is these cells provide different functions for the organism. So they work in a colony to help float, to help steer in a particular direction, to help digest food. They have this gas bladder that is hollow and holds a gas, and it helps it float on top of the water. And basically, it looks like, when we think Portuguese man of war, it looks like a warship. That's why it has that name. And the top looks like sails, and then the bottom looks like the part of the boat that would ride on the water. It really looks like a bicycle helmet with a mohawk on the top. If you've ever seen those, that's kind of what it looks like. And then there it is, floating on the water, which is super cool. And here's one that's washed up, and then there's a Portuguese warship from the 18th century there in the bottom right, so you can kind of see the comparison. And if you think about, the way they eat, like how these cells work together, well, you see those long tentacles that hang down. Well, they have venom in them, and when they sting a fish or anything floating underneath them, even something like plankton, they can paralyze them. And once they're paralyzed, then they can slowly bring them in to where they can actually feed on them. And they'll secrete digestive enzymes, break down the organism, and then they just absorb the nutrients. And then those nutrients diffuse throughout the entire colony. So all the colonial cells are able to be fed by one another, which is really, really cool. So the life cycle of Obelia. For this, it's going to have a polyp and a medusa stage. The gonangium, or the gonozoids, are going to be reproductive polyps that do not have tentacles. And then the hydranth, which is the gastrozoids, they are feeding polyps that do have tentacles. And if we just kind of zoom out and look at this life cycle, As you can see here in the top, it has these medusa. Then as we go around, it goes into this mature form of the organism. And just to kind of go through that, that's alternation of generations. It's going between sexual and asexual reproduction. For the sexual reproduction, you see there at the very top, you have a male and female medusa. So the male medusa produces sperm, female medusa produces the eggs. Then they will have fertilization, which will form the zygote, as you see as it moves around the circle diagram here. The zygote develops into a ciliated planula larvae, and that planula larvae is going to settle and grow into the polyp form. Then the polyp produces new medusas, and then it can bud, strobilation, and that will develop into new medusa being produced. So that would be the asexual reproduction with the budding and the strobilation. The polyp forms feeding structure is called the hydrants or gastrozoids. Let's go form the tentacles. The polyp also forms reproductive polyps called gonangium or gonozoids. And that form does not have tentacles and produces new medusa buds. So what Abelia, the medusa, looks like. You have that circular structure with all these tentacles hanging out around the edges. Kind of looks like a cross in the middle or an X. Really quite beautiful. And then here's the Abelia hydroid. An Abelia hydroid, that is the polyp or colonial stage of the Cnidarian genus Obelia. So this is the colonial stage here. The hydroid colony reproduces asexually by budding off medusae. The medusae reproduce sexually, producing gametes, which will then produce planula larvae, and then produce a new hydroid colony. And you can see those structures labeled there in the image. And then here for your notes, you can label these parts. Number 1 is that hydranth gastrozoid. Number 2 is the gonangium or gonozoids. And then number 3, look like little UFOs with tentacles hanging out, be the male medusa. And then number 4 is the female medusa. You wouldn't be asked to tell the difference between those. You would just be asked if this is the medusa or not. Number 5 is the zygote. Number 6 is the blastula. It's classic terms we use for embryonic development. And then 7 is the planula larvae, ciliated, motile, as we discussed before. So our class, Scyphozoa. For Scyphozoa, what that word comes from is scophos, means in Greek, it means a cup or like a bowl. And then zoon means animal or zoa. So it's cup plus animal. It's cup animal. And that's what it looks like. You see the Aurelia there. It really looks like a little cup. Reproduction is going to be metagenesis. So that'll be alternation of generations. And then we'll look at some examples here. So for Scyphozoa, these are considered the true jellyfish. When you think of a jellyfish, this is what you're thinking of. You're thinking of Scyphozoa. So they have that huge bell shape, right? That medusa form, the swimming stage. And they have these tentacles that hang down, which is pretty cool. So these would be marine invertebrates. And this is what the life cycle of Aurelia looks like. Alternation of generations, moving between sexual and asexual reproduction. And then you can see the forms that they take as they move to produce sperm and egg, form a planula, and then move into the adult form, and then produce medusa, and then produce more sperm and egg, etc., etc. So this is the Aurelia, and it's showing here the strobila, and that is the segmented polyp stage in the Scyphozoa jellyfish. So that strobilation, that's where it divides transversely to release epherae, which will be juvenile medusa. And there's what this life cycle looks like. Life cycles, pretty straightforward. You just follow the arrows, and it shows you what produces which structure or which stage of the organism. Now, in most cnidarians, the medusa will produce the gametes, and then after fertilization, the zygote develops into the planula. So we'll see that a lot with Cnidaria. And then the planula larvae, that's going to develop into a polyp. After, it swims around and finds a good place, it'll become sessile, it attaches to the substrate, and then it metamorphoses into the polyp stage. And then it grows and it could bud, or it could produce more medusae and then produce more sperm and egg through those medusa, etc. The next class would be cubozoa. Think cube, like a box, and then zoa, animal. So this is a box animal. If you look at it, it has that kind of flat edges on the body of this type of jellyfish, which is pretty cool. So the medusa form is the dominant form, and the polyp is inconspicuous. And in some cases, it is unknown. The box jellies are very strong swimmers. That's what's being shown here on the right. And since they are really good strong swimmers, they're really good predators. And they actually prey on fish, particularly in tropical and subtropical environments. The bell is a cube in shape with 4 tentacles hanging from the 4 corners. So that's why it has that name and the shape that it has. So for cubozoa, just an interesting example, would be Chironex fleckeri. This is known as the sea wasp. And what's crazy about this group is they actually can have fatal stings. And people actually die every year from being stung by the sea wasp or the Chironex fleckeri. Now, as far as like how many actually die, it's kind of debated. You know, they have estimates of it. But generally, they'll say it's around 100 people die globally from Chironex fleckeri bite or stings every year. Now, where they occur is in the Philippines. That's where most of them actually happen. And then about 1 person every year will die in Australia from Chironex fleckeri. And what's, the normal quick treatment for being stung by them was to use vinegar. And if they thought, and it was actually demonstrated, that using vinegar would keep any stinging cells that had not fired, it would prevent them from firing any more venom. So the envenomation, would actually stop at that point. But then they've actually, in Australia, of course, they were doing more research, and now they found that actually it will stop the unfired from firing, but it can actually draw out more venom from the cells that have already fired. So now it's like maybe it's not even a good protocol. But they do have treatments for it, but it can cause cardiac arrest, and you can get, massive changes in blood pressure, and you can die from that. And it happens very quickly. The next class is Anthozoa. For Anthozoa, like think anther, so it's flower animal, so animal, flower animal. And these look like flowers. The body form is polyp only, without the medusa. So this would be the cup shape facing up, tentacles coming out the top. Many are going to be colonial, and they form what we call reefs. So examples: sea anemones, sea fans, sea pens, corals is what these are going to be. So here's that sea anemone, which is what we have in Finding Nemo. Remember, you have Nemo, and I believe the dad's name was Marlin. They live in the sea anemone, and they have that symbiotic relationship between the clownfish and the sea anemone. But you can see that stage of the organism coming up, that polyp form. Then you have sea pens, and they look like a pin. It looks like coming out of the ocean floor, it looks like the feathers of a old school feathered pin. They call them sea pens. Sea fans, it looks like one of those fans that somebody would have at church in the summer if there's no AC. And they hold it to cool down their bodies. That's what these look like coming out of the ground. Ocean floor. And then coral is what you see there. And for coral, some really cool story kind of behind coral and where that name comes from. So from the Greek, the name coral comes from the Greek word korallion. And korallion, it just means coral, and it's where we get that word. But in Greek mythology, coral was believed to be the solidified blood of Medusa. And we think of the Medusa form of a jelly of a Cnidaria. The Medusa form, it looks like the tentacles, the snake tentacles of Medusa. And this is considered, a Greek mythological monster. So it has an association with protection from evil and danger from this monster. And the story behind that is, Perseus, he was a demigod, and he was the son of Zeus. He beheaded Medusa, and he did that with the help of Athena and Hermes. So Perseus, he used Athena's shield to block Medusa so that Medusa would see her own reflection, and it was to avoid her gaze to begin with. And then he was able to cut off her head, and then it was thought that the blood actually formed all the coral in the ocean as it solidified. So pretty interesting little story there. So for corals, they secrete an exoskeleton, and we actually have some in the lab that you can feel. It is composed of calcium carbonate. It's like chalky. As they grow upward, the skeletons of the dead corals accumulate, and that's what forms the reef. Corals form a symbiotic relationship with dinoflagellates, which are these photosynthetic organisms. So coral reefs only develop in shallow water because they have a symbiotic relationship with photosynthesizers. So they can't be, deeper than 100 meters because they won't get enough sunlight to have that symbiotic relationship. And they have all those beautiful colors that you see in like Finding Nemo and different movies where they're diving into the ocean. And all those colors have to do with the pigments in that photosynthetic relationship they have, or symbiotic relationship with photosynthesizers, and those pigments to absorb the different wavelengths of light, so you get all these beautiful colors. So really, really cool. And the next class, for some classification systems, add this Staurozoa, and they look like a little star. They have all these branches coming out from them. So star, we think Staurozoa animals, star animals. That's based on what they look like. So this group has a Medusa stage, but is attached by a stalk emerging from the aboral side. The planula larvae creeps along instead of drifting or swimming. Then we have our comb jellies, sea walnuts, gooseberries, and other assorted Fruit Loops. So classification would be domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, and the phylum would be Cnidaria, or comb-bearing. This would be the comb jellies. So for these, the Cnidaria, the characteristics, they have a spherical shape with 8 radially arranged rows of comb plates. And that would be used for swimming. No nematocyst, but they do have tentacles with coloblast, or what they call glue cells. And the glue cells are for sticking to prey. That's why they call them glue cells, so they can capture their prey, which is pretty cool. They exhibit bioluminescence, so they can glow in the dark. This next organism would be Tortopsis dornii. This is a genus species, and it's known as the immortal jellyfish. So it's literally immortal. If it's injured or damaged, it reverts back to polyp form, and then it creates new medusa, and in this way it goes on forever and ever and ever. And then the most interesting thing for the end here, so the best for last, is called a barrel jellyfish. This is the largest species of Cnidarian. It can be 3 to 5 feet in length. Imagine that. In the image there, you can see that person swimming by it. The bell diameter of 3 feet across, which is crazy. Now, these organisms, you would think they would be super dangerous, but they've never been documented to kill a human. If they sting someone, it's considered, mild. Called skin irritation, nothing really to be worried about. It's really designed for capturing plankton, not for harming like really large animals or humans or anything like that. So they're pretty safe. Leatherback turtles will actually eat them. They're a good food source for them, but no danger to humans at all. So anyway, that's Cnidaria.